If you are a Chinese living in Malaysia or Singapore, then what I'm about to share with you in this video is going to be astonishing if you have not already known about it. So let's get into it. For today's video, we are going to go back in time, but not to a too distant past. We are just going to go back to the year 1900, 1900. And I want to show you that even as recent as 1900, things are so different from it is today. Let's go back in time to 1900 and to Georgetown in Penang, Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, and let's walk the street. And what we'll discover in the streets of Georgetown, Kuala Lumpur and Singapore is that you'll find a lot of Chinese people, but none of them have ever heard of Mandarin. Isn't that surprising? In the year 1900, 1900, if you walk the street, you'll be having Hokkien people speaking Hokkien, Cantonese people speaking Cantonese, the Teochew will speak Teochew, and the Hakka will speak Hakka. But in each of those cities, there would be a lingua franca among the Chinese. And so in Georgetown, it would be Penang Hokkien. In Kuala Lumpur, it would be Cantonese. And in Singapore, it would be Singapore Hokkien. But there is no Mandarin. Mandarin, which 50 years later in 1950, you will find it in all the Chinese schools, being taught to the Chinese students that this is their language all along. But in reality, just 50 years before that, the people, the Chinese in these three places, or should I say throughout the Malay Peninsula, has never heard of Mandarin. Mandarin, yes, the language exists, but it is used by the people called Mandarin. That is to say, the bureaucrats. If those bureaucrats do come all the way from Beijing to Singapore to Georgetown to Kuala Lumpur, then yes, you will hear Mandarin being spoken. But Mandarin at that time is not a written language at all. It's very different from the Mandarin that we know today. The Mandarin in 1900 is different, and it is something that is so totally foreign to what we have right now. Because in 1900, the people have never heard of Mandarin. So how was the situation like? What were they writing if there is no Mandarin? Well, back then, and I need to also point out to you that if you look at 1900, none of the Chinese schools in Malaysia and Singapore has been established yet. The oldest Chinese school in Singapore, the Tao Nan School, was only established in the year 1906. And the Tao Nan School, for those who are in Singapore, you'll be familiar with the building because today it houses the Peranakan Museum. Yeah, the building for the Peranakan Museum on Armenian Street is the Tao Nan School, the oldest Chinese school in Singapore. And in Kuala Lumpur, we have the Confucian Private Secondary School, which is still there in Kuala Lumpur under the shadows of the Merdeka 118 Tower. So from Merdeka, you look down at Lorong Hang Jebat and you will see the oldest Chinese school in Kuala Lumpur. In Penang, the oldest Chinese schools are Chung Ling, which was established in 1917, and the Penang Chinese Girls High School in 1919. But none of them existed in the year 1900. In comparison, the British have already established their schools to teach the people. The Penang Free School has been around since 1816, even earlier than the founding of Singapore itself. And in Singapore, we have the Raffles Institution, which was established in 1823. In Kuala Lumpur, we have the Victoria Institution, which was also established in the 1893. Yeah, I'm looking at my notes here. 1893, because Kuala Lumpur had a rather later start than Penang and Singapore. Kuala Lumpur is already in the Singkat period. So why is it that there are no Chinese schools in the 19th century in the Malay Peninsula? Well, the reason is that it's something which is the topic of today's video, that we have a forgotten history of the Chinese language. The Chinese language back in the 19th century is different from the Chinese language that we have today. When we say Chinese today, we are talking about Mandarin. Modern Standard Mandarin is the language that is used to speak and to write among the Chinese people today. But it's not so in the 19th century. In 19th century, there is a system called diglossia. Diglossia means a two-language system. It comes from the Greek word di means two and glossa means language. From glossa we get the word glossary. So diglossia means a two-language system. What do I mean by two-language system? There is the high language or upper register, and there's the lower language or lower register. The lower register is the spoken language. So it could be Hokkien. Hokkien as used in Penang, Hokkien as used in Singapore, or it could be Cantonese, it could be Teochew, Hakka, and so on. That is the lower register. In other words, that's the vernacular language, the language used for speaking. But on top of that, there is the written language. The written language is the language that only the elites have the opportunity to learn. That is to say, in 19th century China, and by extension to Malay Peninsula, you don't find Chinese school because back in the 19th century, learning to read and write is an absolute privilege. If you are a commoner, you won't have the chance or the means to afford education. And not only that, the language used is very different from the spoken language. And that language is called literary Chinese. But for you to understand more about literary Chinese, we are going to go to an episode of the China podcast so that we let James and Jessica explain it, and then I'll come back and give you more information on how it was like back in the 19th century, why it is so different and why it's so absolutely forgotten, because Mandarin, modern standard Mandarin, has since covered it all up, and when we are talking about Chinese today, we are referring to Mandarin. But let's go to the podcast now and listen to James and Jessica explain about literary Chinese.
All right, so today we're diving into 19th century China. And we're tackling a language puzzle that's, well, it's fascinating and kind of mind-boggling. Imagine if the official written language, the one for laws and stuff, was practically a secret code.
Yeah, it's a really unique situation, not just regular illiteracy. It's more like a system.
Mm-hmm.
Where the written language, they called it literary Chinese or Wenyanwen, was basically a world of its own, completely different from how people talked every day.
Whoa, so it wasn't that people couldn't read. It's that the official stuff was like reading something from another planet, trying to understand laws, government stuff in a language you've never heard spoken. How did their society even function?
It does make you think about, power and who had access to what.
Yeah.
Literary Chinese, it was so deeply rooted in these ancient texts, packed with historical stuff, complex Confucian ideas. You'd need years, seriously, years of study to master it.
So, if we tried to learn English today only by reading Shakespeare...
Pretty much.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're getting at. Instant barrier for anyone who wasn't already part of the elite. Was this on purpose? Did they want to keep people in the dark?
Well, whether it was deliberate or just how things evolved, the outcome was the same. Knowledge, and therefore power, was in the hands of a select few. We're talking about the Mandarins, the guys running China. Couldn't read literary Chinese. You were basically left out of the decisions that shaped your life.
The Mandarins, they had their secret code. And that code was their ticket to staying on top, like some exclusive club where the entry fee is a decade of hardcore studying. But I'm guessing it wasn't just wannabe bureaucrats who saw value in this, right?
Absolutely. Even outside government, literary Chinese had this power. Think about it. Merchants, they needed it for contracts. Priests used it for their religious texts. Even some criminals, they learned it to find legal loopholes. No matter what you wanted to achieve, this language was the key.
So, unspoken rule, want to climb ANY ladder, learn literary Chinese. Makes you wonder, was there ever any pushback? Anyone trying to, make the language more accessible?
Great question. And that brings us to something truly intriguing. The spoken languages of China. Alongside this official written form, they had this huge array of spoken dialects, some so different they were practically separate languages altogether.
Hold up, you mean people can understand each other talking but could read the same stuff written down? That's wild. How is that even possible?
It all comes down to how Chinese characters work. They're logographic, meaning each character represents a concept, not a sound. Like, think of emojis. We all understand them, even if we call them different things.
Ah, okay, I get it. So someone from, say, Beijing and someone from Canton, they could both read a government announcement, even if they couldn't understand a word of each other's speech.
Exactly. Literally on the same page, but in totally different worlds when they open their mouths. Pretty clever system, really.
Mind-blowing. This disconnect, though, between spoken and written, did that ever cause, like, legal problems?
You're on the right track. This disconnect had a huge GE impact, especially in the legal system. Imagine trying to defend yourself in court when you can't even understand the charges against you.
Chilling. Sounds like even if you were innocent, the system was rigged against you if you weren't part of that elite literary Chinese-speaking circle.
Precisely. And it wasn't just courtrooms. Everyday stuff, contracts, agreements, even understanding the terms of a loan. If you couldn't read literary Chinese, you were at the mercy of those who could.
This wasn't just about communication then, it was about power, plain and simple. But wait, if this written language was so crucial for everything, how did anyone outside the elite learn it? Was there, like, public education or something?
That's where things get even more interesting. Access to education, especially in literary Chinese, it wasn't exactly equal.
Oh boy, here we go.
Yeah. Mostly wealthy boys got that privilege. You know, the ones expected to manage estates, carry on the family line, maybe try for those government jobs. Everyone else, the system wasn't exactly built to help them move up in the world.
So, not a rich boy, you're basically out of luck. Girls, poor kids, no chance to crack the code. It's like they designed it to keep things the way they were, huh?
You're catching on fast. And to really get how this worked, we got to look at the heart of it all. The infamous civil service exams, these weren't just tests, they were trials by fire to decide who got to join the elite.
Okay, I'm picturing the SATs, but like on steroids. And instead of college, you're fighting for power and prestige.
Exactly.
Tell me, how brutal are we talking?
Brutal is putting it mildly. Imagine spending like a decade studying, often crammed in tiny rooms, poring over ancient texts day in, day out. Some scholars even said it was like torture, and they weren't exaggerating. The failure rate was insane, which is exactly what the Mandarins wanted.
So not just brains, but endurance, dedication, and a whole lot of luck. I'm starting to see how this language, the way it was taught, it really was a tool for control. Like weeding out anyone who didn't fit their mold, regardless of actual talent.
Very astute observation. And to truly grasp what this meant, we need to shift back to those spoken dialects. See, while literary Chinese was the language of power, those dialects, they were the voice of the people.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Let's dive into that world, shall we? See how those dialects shaped everyday life for everyone else. So we've got this elite group, they're using their secret code, this literary Chinese, but then there's like a whole other world of spoken dialects happening. How many dialects are we even talking about? Help me get my head around this.
It's tough to put a hard number on it, but let's just say China was, and kind of still is, incredibly diverse when it comes to language. Some scholars even argue that certain dialects are really more like separate languages entirely. We're not just talking accents here, but completely different ways of speaking, different grammar, different vocabulary, the works.
Whoa. So picture having a conversation with someone whose language is as foreign to you as like Finnish or Swahili. That's what it was like for folks from different parts of China trying to talk to each other. Sounds like daily life was interesting, to put it mildly.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
But people figured out ways to make it work. Remember those logographic Chinese characters we were talking about? They were the key to getting around this linguistic mess. Because each character, it's about a concept, not a sound. People could read the same text and get it, even if they pronounced it totally differently.
So it's like a universal written language, even though when they spoke, it was totally different worlds. Like they were communicating on two levels. One written that connected them across regions, and then these separate spoken levels that tied them to their specific communities.
That's a great way to think about it. Pretty clever system, right? Allowed for some unity across this huge, diverse empire. Mm-hmm. But it's important to remember, even with those shared characters, variations existed.
Wait, so even in writing, things weren't totally the same. I thought we were talking about a universal system here.
Well, think about it like this. You and I, we both speak English, but our accents, the slang we use, it might give away where we're from, right? Same idea in China. Different regions had their own styles of calligraphy, almost like handwriting variations. Subtle ways to tell them apart.
So even in their writing, you could see hints of where they were from, like their regional identities sneaking in. These dialects were so deeply ingrained, they even changed how people wrote those shared characters.
You got it. But even with these little differences, the core structure of literary Chinese stayed mostly consistent. It's pretty amazing how much staying power this ancient written form had.
Makes you appreciate the history behind those characters, right? It's not just writing, it's like centuries of tradition and understanding baked right in. But let's get back to those spoken languages. I'm still wrapping my head around how different they really were. Can you give me an example, like a real concrete one?
Sure. Take Cantonese and Mandarin. They're both considered Chinese, but they're totally mutually unintelligible. Someone who only spoke Cantonese wouldn't understand a word of Mandarin. They might as well be speaking Greek and Russian for all the good it would do them.
Wow, okay, that really paints a picture. So how did people from different areas actually talk to each other? Did everyone learn, like, a bunch of dialects?
For a lot of people, their local dialect was all they really knew. They might pick up bits and pieces of others through travel or trade, but being fluent in tons of dialects,
Yeah.
not super common, just not practical, when you're dealing with potentially hundreds of different ways of speaking.
So how'd they bridge that gap? I mean, I'm sure there were situations all the time where people from different regions needed to talk, trade, travel, just daily life. Did they just resort to, like, hand gestures and charades?
Well, I'm sure there was a lot of that going on, but in many cases, they relied on what you might call intermediaries. These were people who knew multiple dialects, could translate, interpret, basically make communication happen between groups.
Ah, so like linguistic middlemen. I bet they were pretty important in a place with such a crazy mix of languages.
Oh, absolutely vital. Especially for trade and stuff, where folks from different areas were always interacting. Imagine trying to make a deal when you can't even understand the other person. You definitely want a skilled intermediary there to make sure everything's clear.
It does make you wonder, though, did those folks have a certain kind of power then? They were the ones who could unlock understanding, after all.
That's a great point, and it gets at this bigger idea, how language shapes power dynamics. We often think of power in terms of politics or money, but in 19th century China, just knowing the right language, that could be a form of power in itself.
So it wasn't just the mandarins up top with their fancy literary Chinese. Anyone who could navigate that whole world of spoken dialects had an advantage too. Like, there were multiple layers of linguistic power, all influencing who had access to stuff, to information. Fascinating.
It was a complex system, that's for sure, full of contradictions. But while those dialects caused some headaches, they also fostered a really strong sense of regional pride, of cultural richness. Each one carried its own history, traditions, ways of expressing themselves.
So it wasn't just about talking, it was about belonging, about connection to your roots. These dialects were how people held onto their heritage, how they showed they were different from other regions. Like, each dialect was a thread in this giant tapestry of Chinese culture, making it even richer and more intricate.
I like that, a tapestry. And even though literary Chinese might seem like it was pushing everyone towards being the same, the spoken language has made sure that a ton of diversity in language and culture survived. It shows that even when people try to standardize things, human expression finds a way.
Like a constant tug of war between unity and diversity, right? Each one shaping the other in these fascinating ways. But didn't we say earlier that this whole language divide had a dark side too? It wasn't all happy dialects and cultural celebrations.
You're right. We do need to dig into the social impact of all this a bit deeper. Because while those dialects were definitely a source of cultural wealth, they also contributed to some serious issues, especially when it came to fairness and who had access to what.
Okay, I'm hearing a but coming here. Break it down for me. How did these dialects end up causing problems, particularly for folks who are already struggling? So, downsides. If these dialects helped people keep their cultural identity, how did they become a problem? Especially for those who are already kind of on the margins of society.
Put yourself in their shoes for a second. Imagine living in a world where the official language, the one for laws and stuff, is basically totally different from what you speak at home. How do you deal with legal matters, contracts? Even just understanding a notice from the government could be a huge obstacle.
Like trying to play a game where the rule book is written in a language you don't even know. Doesn't seem very fair, does it?
Not at all. And this wasn't just some theory. It had real consequences. Imagine a farmer who needs a loan. He only speaks his local dialect, but the loan agreement, that's written in literary Chinese. Who really holds the power in that situation? This happened all the time across China.
Back to that power imbalance, right? If you couldn't understand literary Chinese, you were always at a disadvantage, almost like a system designed to keep things unequal.
You could definitely see it that way. And it wasn't just about money either. Think about education. Remember those crazy civil service exams? Only offered in literary Chinese. So if you hadn't learned that language in a formal setting, you were basically shut out.
So even if you were super smart, had the potential to be a scholar or government official, didn't matter. The language you spoke held you back. That's just wrong.
It really shows how language can be used not just to communicate, but to control, to decide who gets ahead and who doesn't. It's why having access to education, to language learning, is so vital if you want a fair society.
It makes you think about similar things happening today, right? Who has access to certain types of knowledge, to education, whose voices get heard, and whose get ignored.
Absolutely. But let's get back to 19th century China for a minute. As the century went on, this tension between the elite language and all those dialects, it started to come to a head. China was changing new technologies, more trade, and people started realizing they needed a language that was more unified, more accessible.
So this system just wasn't working anymore. What happened then? Did they try to, reform literary Chinese, or was something more drastic needed?
They went for something pretty drastic, led to one of the biggest linguistic shifts in modern history. Movements popped up to promote what they called vernacular Chinese. It was based on the Mandarin dialect, which a lot of people spoke. But this wasn't just about simplifying the written language. It was about creating a whole new standard, one that matched how people actually talked.
So taking power away from that elite language and giving it back to everyday people, I bet that caused some controversy.
Oh, huge controversy. Debates, traditionalists pushing back, people even saying they were destroying Chinese culture. But this movement, it gained steam. More and more people realized that if China wanted to modernize, to progress, it needed a language everyone could understand.
It's mind-blowing to think about how big of a change that was. To shift an entire country's language, to change how people read, write, even think. Massive.
It took decades, lots of bumps along the way. But eventually it led to the language reforms you see in China today. Mandarin Chinese is the official language, and literacy rates have gone way up.
So they took this super complex language puzzle with its secret codes and all those dialects and somehow found a way to make it work for everyone. What a story.
It really shows how adaptable language is and how much humans crave connection, communication.
As we wrap up this deep dive into 19th century Chinese language, I'm just struck by how powerful words are. They shape societies, create barriers, but they can also be a force for change. It's a story that goes beyond a specific time or place. A reminder that language isn't just about talking, it's about power, identity, about who we are at our core.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as we deal with all the ways language is changing in our own world, I think the lessons from 19th century China are really valuable. They show us how words can both bring us together and divide us, and that impact is lasting.
So from the Mandarin secret code to the incredible world of dialects and that huge push for reform, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about. What's the biggest takeaway for you? What will you be pondering after we sign off today?
For me, it's the reminder that being able to use language means having power. When language is used to shut people out, it can have consequences that last for generations. But when we try to include everyone, when we work to make language something everyone can access, we open up so many possibilities for individuals, for society as a whole.
Well said. That's a wrap on our deep dive into the fascinating world of 19th century Chinese language. Thanks for joining us on this journey. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
Back in 19th century Penang, Kuala Lumpur, and Singapore, the Chinese are largely illiterate. Everybody is illiterate because the spoken language is, as I said, a spoken language. It's not a written language. You may have heard of people saying Old Hokkien, Old Cantonese, and so on. But when they say Old Hokkien or Old Cantonese, they are actually referring to the literary Chinese as read in Hokkien or as read in Cantonese. So this literary Chinese is a marvelous invention that has lasted for 1,000 years largely unchanged. But it is very different from the spoken language. That is to say, the grammar is different. It is it is usually shorter than the spoken language because it doesn't use a lot of words that we find in commonplace, such as pronouns and so on. So it is almost like a code. It's like learning Braille. It's like learning Braille in order to communicate. But this system is marvelous in that literary Chinese is one writing system which all the different Chinese people who become literate, who were educated, can read despite pronouncing it differently one from the other. So this Old Hokkien and the Old Cantonese and so on are actually the same language but pronounced differently. So the Hokkien people who learn to read literary Chinese would pronounce literary Chinese in the Hokkien literary reading. The Cantonese would do the same in the Cantonese literary reading. So they can understand what is written, so the emperor could issue a decree, and the decree can be passed throughout China and all the provinces of China. It will be received by the bureaucrats in all the provinces of China. Those bureaucrats would be able to read literary Chinese in his own literary reading. So if that decree arrives in Fujian province, then the bureaucrat in Fujian province would understand what the emperor has just said, and he would read it out in Hokkien literary reading, which another person who understands Hokkien literary reading would understand. However, the commoner will be speaking in colloquial or vernacular Hokkien. That's the spoken Hokkien. And the pronunciation of many words in the literary reading would be different from the colloquial pronunciation. So once again, it is not something which the commoner can understand. So a person who is educated will still have to interpret what has been written to a commoner, because the commoner cannot understand what has been written even if it's read out to him, because the reading pronunciation differs from the spoken pronunciation. If you go into my dictionary, the Penang Hokkien dictionary, you will see that some of the words I do show the vernacular pronunciation as well as the literary pronunciation. So when you see literary pronunciation, it means how that Chinese character is pronounced in the when it was read under literary Chinese. However, nowadays and across, what we are using is the vernacular form of Hokkien, the spoken Hokkien. And that spoken Hokkien is different from literary Chinese. And so, in the old days, there is an occupation that does not exist anymore. Imagine that you are a coolie arriving in Georgetown and you are illiterate, but you need to send a message home to your home family back in Fujian province. What do you do? How do you get your message there? Okay, back then there's no email, so you can't email anybody. So life is very different. And moreover, you are illiterate. What you do is you go to maybe the Chinese Protector's Office or the Clan Association, and you look for a person whose occupation is scribe. The scribe will, you'll pay the scribe a fee, and then you will tell the scribe the address, your home address, and what you want to say. For example, you may want to say that I have safely arrived in Georgetown and I have been housed in my clan association because I'm of this so and so clan, and they are making arrangement for me to move to Krian Pao in the Larut area, which I've never been, but I'm going there soon to do the tin mining activities, and I hope to be sending money home whenever I receive it regularly. So that could be a message from a coolie, and he would tell that message to the scribe. The scribe's job is to write down the message, not in the Hokkien that is spoken to him, but in literary Chinese. And then via the clan association or the Chinese Protector's Office, that letter would then be shipped back to Fujian province and will arrive perhaps in the clan association, where there would be another scribe, and the clan association would then get in touch with the family, and they would come, and once again, they too are illiterate. And so the letter that has arrived, they cannot read. So they need their scribe on the other end to read that letter to them. So the scribe may not only read the letter in literary Chinese, but he will reinterpret it into vernacular Chinese, into vernacular Hokkien. So from literary Chinese, if that family happens to be Hokkien, then he would tell the family what has been written in the letter. So that letter can go anywhere in China and still be understood. If it goes to Guangdong province and is intended for somebody in Guangdong, there will be a scribe over there who would then be able to interpret it back into Cantonese. So that is the marvelous invention that existed for over 1,000 years. That we have one writing system that can be understood across China despite it being read differently in different provinces, and despite the vernacular language being different from the written language and what is being read out. So that, my friend, is the mystery of a historical part of Chinese language that today a lot of people do not understand, because what we have back then has been replaced by Mandarin. And in our next video, I will explain to you how Mandarin took over this system. Why the Chinese are now identifying themselves with Mandarin, and why Mandarin? Why not other languages? Why Mandarin become standard Chinese? For that, we'll do it in our next video, and I hope to see you soon over there. And meanwhile, if you enjoy what I have just shared in this video, please give it a like so that YouTube will show it to more people. And also, subscribe to the Learn Penang Hokkien YouTube channel so that I can continue to bring you more videos on the history of Chinese languages and also the history of the Chinese people according to what I have researched. Thank you so much, and Kam Salut, Jie.